Welcome. Good evening, everybody. I am so thrilled to introduce this stranger from up north Mississippi, from Amory, Mississippi, from the New Hope Church of Christ. Not really a stranger. Most of us know Trevor, but thankfully, praise to God, that we do have some people who may not have been introduced to Trevor before. So I'll tell you a little bit about him. Trevor comes to us. He is a graduate of the Bear Valley Institute. Upon graduation, he came and worked with us here at Margaret Street for a year. He is somebody that really endeared himself to the congregation, and he's definitely one of our own. He enjoys Transformers. He told me to do this off the cuff, so I'm going off the cuff. Making tea for the youth. He likes doing that. And animals, but above all else, he loves the Lord, so we're looking forward to your lesson, Trevor.
I'm not exactly sure how to take that, but I would take it for, fortunately enough for you, you didn't know me before today. But I suppose, just like any bad news, it was eventually going to get to you. So I hope you can put up with me today. I do actually have a little bit of housekeeping before we get to this. You might recall that just a couple of weeks ago, the youth came up to do a little bit of mission work there at the Amory congregation there in New Hope. And as it would happen with most youth things, stuff got left behind. So, particularly if you had a son who came up there, you should probably touch base with me, because there's a good chance those towels you've been looking for, we've found them freshly washed. There are also a pair of socks, not the same pair, mind you. In fact, I'm not convinced they belong to the same person. But there's also two socks that belong to children, one that definitely belonged to one of the male chaperones. So, ladies, you can feel free to rub it in their faces for that. There were also two Bibles left, so way to go, fellas. That's not so great there. One of them does belong to an elder son. I'll just let you figure out who that might have been. I'm really grateful to be part of this particular summer series, and I'm glad we're doing this for two reasons. First of all, it's actually kind of near and dear to my heart in an interesting way. Before I went to Bear Valley, my mom actually gave me the idea at one point to do the children's Bible stories for grown-ups, which is kind of, as I understand, what you guys have been doing. Is that right? What have we learned about so far? I'm not starting this off. So who have we learned about so far? And what's on the roster? This is not a sermon, by the way. There will be opportunity for a little bit of dialogue here, so feel free to. David and Goliath, excellent one. Abraham and the burning bush? You talk about off the cuff. See, everybody heard Abraham, but what he actually said, I read your lips, Paul. He said Moses. Those are the letters that he mouthed. So these excellent stories of the Bible that surely you've learned wonderful lessons from. Part of why it's so important we're discussing this, and perhaps you've already heard this before, and allow me to reiterate it. If not, I'm glad to bring it forth. There is this notion today that the word story implies fairy tale or folklore, or maybe an allegory in some cases. Ken Ham, the leader of the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum, he made point of that so many people today hear this word story and automatically dismiss anything that follows as legendary or some wives' tale. Let me reassure you, as if you needed that already, but perhaps there are some folks tuning into this, that what we're discussing in all of this series, but perhaps I'll argue chiefly tonight, that everything that you have heard discussed and everything you will hear discussed, everything you will participate in discussion in, happened. These are not mere children's stories. These are not merely things that just endear a little one who can't think really for themselves just yet to what we want them to believe. Obviously, we do want them to believe it, but that's because it's truth. These are historical accounts that we'll be looking at. Tonight, We're looking at what is perhaps the most readily contested one in the public eye regarding any of the subjects. I mean, you think about most skepticism when it comes to the Bible in general, right? You think of even, let's look at the character of Jesus. They'll call him a character, a story character, right? It's true, he was a historical character, but that's not what they mean. But they'll at least say that he was worth listening to. You'll look at David and Goliath, and at least they'll draw out an allegory there of sometimes the underdog overcomes the big odds, even though that's not really what that was about. It was about God's glory. But what we have to discuss tonight, the creation account, you will find very ample opposition to when you depart these walls. I imagine you've dealt with that before. Has anybody actively had a conversation about, say, evolution or the timeline of the earth? You ever participate in any of that? I'm seeing a couple of hands. Yeah. You will have people who will argue with this. They'll talk about how Genesis chapters 1 and 2 don't even account for the same story, and they'll say that it's already filled with contradictions, chapters 1 and 2 of the Bible. That's not true. We probably won't have a lot of time to talk about that tonight. In fact, I don't imagine we'll get much past verse 1 tonight of all things. But understand once more that this is a historical account of what really, truly happened. Now, with that in mind, as we begin this conversation tonight, let's keep a couple of things at the forefront. First of all, take note of the fact that though there is a ton of apologetic value, that is, we can defend the Bible, or at least we can look in the world around us and see that there is evidence that supports what we're going to discuss tonight. Though there is plenty of that, and we will talk about that because we are adults in here, and I think it's important to discuss some of those things, the purpose of it is to draw glory to God. Genesis chapters 1, 2, really all the way through 5, help establish the historical outline of where Israel came from, that ultimately Jesus arose out of, that Savior for whom you and I have need. That's a primary purpose of Genesis. But you'll take note of a number of times that certain phrases show up, particularly in chapter 1 as well as chapter 2 up through verse 3. There are a couple of phrases that you'll hear repeated a couple of times that emphasize just how wonderful this is. I will add one more note before we actually just straight up read Genesis chapter 1 through 2-3. It'll take about 5 minutes, but that'll help refresh our minds to some things. There is a bit of a poetic structure to Genesis chapter 1. But let me ask you a question. Does a poetic structure imply that the poem isn't truth? No. I asked that kind of in a funny way, kind of a double negative. Forgive me. Just because something is a poem doesn't mean it's false. In fact, when you think of how the world operated at this time, right? They didn't have writing up until about the time of Moses, who wrote this. The only way that they could really communicate things regularly was through oral speaking. I guess you can't really do much other than oral speaking. Is there nasal speaking out there? If you heard some of my singing that I did earlier, you might argue there was some nasal speaking. So poetry was a very useful technique to help everybody pre-printing press, which, by the way, relatively recent invention in the grand scheme of the history of the world. We're going to start with the beginning of its history tonight. There is a bit of a poetic structure. This is one of those things that, as adults, it's reasonable to know and that we should know. It's not something that maybe we want to tell our kids because they might be more easily swayed to disbelieve it because of some false notion that poetry isn't believable. All right, enough with the introductory stuff. Let's begin. Let's read through Genesis chapter 1. Let's refresh our memories to this supposedly well-known passage of Scripture. Take note of anything that you've perhaps not noticed before. Take notice of anything that you see repeated. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version, which is a personal favorite of mine. It occurs to me just now that I have muted this microphone the entire time and have been talking from that. Now we're different. All right, let's begin. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind, on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." And so God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." And so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. And so God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. There's not much that we could add to that. Indeed, anything that we try to add to the Bible is erroneous anyway. And so that's not what we're going to try to accomplish tonight. Tonight, what we're going to do is look at some deep truths that are held within this account. Give me a summary. Someone give us a summary of what we've just read. Bonus points if you can give us something out of chapter 2. Double bonus points if you can give us something out of chapter 3. Don't be shy. We can work together. Our kids would do this. They'd already be shouting and I'd have to be saying, whoa, 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 hold on. Come on. God created the universe. How did he accomplish that? He spoke. Oh man, we're already pulling out some wonderful things. He spoke, and what followed after pretty much every one of those instances? And it was so, and it happened, it came to be. It was good. What happens in chapter 2? I know we've not read it, but think briefly. You can feel free to use your cheat sheet. That's called your Bible. What happens roughly in chapter 2? Say again? He rested. That's where chapter 2 begins. The detailed account of what's happened in Genesis chapter 1. He breathes life into the nostrils. Does he do that with anyone else? Nah, we don't have any record of it anyway. We might have time to talk about some of those cool things in chapter 2, but frankly, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Is that right? 9, 10 words there? I think it's 9. Only a handful more syllables. It's a wonderful thing to talk about all of the exciting things that God ultimately creates, right? Perhaps chiefly the plants and the animals. That's why we like to talk about it with the little ones. That's why Trevor likes to talk about it. You know that I'm a zoo guy. That's my past before I got into ministry. We could talk about the animals, and I think maybe we'll get a chance to do that because there are some pretty remarkable things that in the creation of animals and plants that are deep truths that perhaps you don't realize or notice in a quick reading. But this first sentence, these first 10 words, I should have looked. I'm not sure how many words occur in the Hebrew. Richard, do you happen to know that offhand? Okay. There is such deep-seated truth here that it separates everybody who believes in the one true God from everything else on earth. I want you to take note of this. Let's look again. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, Josh, you used a word earlier to describe what we have just discussed here. What was that word? Universe. Is there a word, do you know, is there a word in Hebrew for the term universe? Not a direct translation anyway. This phrase, the heavens and the earth, encompasses all of creation, what we would call today the universe. When you hear the term creation, when you hear the word universe, you can essentially make those synonymous, at least if you have the proper worldview. But as amazing as it is that God created the heavens and the earth, and we'll look at that in a sec, notice that it's in the beginning God created. Well, if we just talked about how God has created the heavens and the earth, and this is occurring at the beginning, what does that imply about God? Beginning of time. But what does that further suggest about God? He was there first. And see, this is one of those deep-seated truths. This is why some of the things we have to discuss tonight are just outright incomprehensible. Because God wasn't there first.
because that implies a passage of time, right? God is beyond time. We can't even think of our great God beyond saying He's first. Don't get it twisted. I'm not trying to suggest that God and the universe were simultaneous. That's not at all what I'm getting at. But there is something about our God and His eternal nature that supersedes the need for time in a way that you and I can't understand. So we have the beginning of time here, but we also have everything that makes up the universe. That's matter, that's energy, that's the laws of physics, folks. I don't know how many folks in here took physics, but I imagine you probably have heard the word gravity before. Do you know that there's no real reason for gravity? We understand a lot about it, or at least a lot of its effects. It's a very predictable thing. But why gravity? There's not a good answer for that. Not at least in the secular worldview. Did I hear someone say something? If you've got comments, feel free to shout them forward, because there is some cool stuff here. So not only do we have the timeless God, who is not bound by time, not bound by this sequential order of before and after, whatever that means, we also have this incredible God who doesn't need something. This right here is what there was in the beginning. Except not really. Because what you perceive is actually a slide that I colored black. And so you have it's not really pigment because it's light, but bear with me. You have the pigment. There's something there. Or maybe look at this desk that we have here. Troy, you just showed me how to use this thing. It's in the back. Oh, there it is. Thank you. So look at this. And I'm the first one to use it. So, or I guess second one. And the one who knew how to use it didn't train me beforehand. He trained me right now on the job. Let everybody laugh at me while I'm at it. What's on this desk? Is there? Is there nothing on this desk? There's air on this desk. But you know what? Forget the air. Let's pretend we're in space right now, and somehow we can all breathe in space. There's no air. Let's pretend there's no air on the desk. Now what's on the desk? Space. Not nothing, space. Our great and glorious God, incomprehensible as He is, made something from nothing. Empty space is not nothing. It may not seem like there's anything there, but space is something. It's something that you can talk about and perceive. Nothingness is not empty blackness like you see on the screen up there. It's not some hard and fast barrier that something cannot pass. Nothing and something are mutually exclusive. There is nothing in nothing. I realize we're saying that word a lot, and it's probably not really helping it to just say it over and over and over again. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter how many times I say it, and I imagine there's probably not many people who are eloquent enough to really help us understand what it means, because humans can't do it. Only God can do what we have seen in Genesis. You know, it's interesting. Just saw a video the other day about atheists a couple of guys on there were discussing atheism. And I try not to attack any worldview from the pulpit, largely because in some ways they can at least be a little understandable. Like, I can understand why an atheist might want to be an atheist in some ways, because you can't see God and interact with God in the same way you can interact with, well, anything we can interact with in a physical sense. So it's at least understandable. But this is the premier problem. Forget evolution, which we might have time to talk about tonight. Forget that. Forget the Big Bang. But that very beginning, whatever that means in the secularist worldview, do you know what these guys were discussing? They actually quoted a guy, like I found the quote they were talking about. Do you know what the atheist must say regarding the start of the universe? If God doesn't exist, they ask for this one miracle. You get the irony there, don't you? Because you can't have the miraculous without one who could provide miracles. And we laugh a little bit, or at least I chuckle a little bit. But this is where we really need to have a deep pit of sympathy in our guts, because, y'all, that is the most hopeless worldview that exists. We can look at the world around us now, the culture that I know, that as some of you have grown up and had children, grandchildren, maybe great-grandchildren. I don't know if there's anyone in here who's got great-great-grandchildren. I imagine there's not much after that, if there is. But it's not the same world you grew up in. It's not the same United States you grew up in. And you know why that is? It's because people are starting to embrace this godless notion, and they don't get the hope of how this great God, who in the beginning created something from nothing, though I suppose perhaps you could argue he used his will. Y'all, we've been talking for 20 minutes. We're not past verse 1. That is the God you and I worship. Now, of course, on day one, never quite sure what it's going to look like up there. On day one, we have this beginning where God creates the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and it was void and without form. Bear in mind real quick, though that's a good translation of what the words say, to understand formless and void, it's not like the earth was this wad of chewing gum just kind of floating around in the blackness of space, okay? Even though it would have been the blackness before light. Time is such a weird thing to discuss about it, this particular scenario. But really what that means is, think more of like a wasteland. And you'll notice that though the earth was formless and void, darkness was over the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. It was, in whatever way this looked, it was a watery wasteland. Not sure what that looks like. We know that the earth was not yet separated from the seas, so clearly the earth was covered in water. But nevertheless, there was this object here ready to receive God's will. There is one great theological point here, in addition to what we've discussed. Notice who was hovering over the face of the waters. The Spirit of God, right? Keep that in mind, because it's about 7:30. Is that my time limit? 7:40? You're trying to help. 25? 7:25?
Invitation at 7:40.
Crud. Like I said, forget evolution. there is a very good theological point here that we cannot escape. We'll make sure that we get that announced before the invitation. But as we go through this story here, this historical story, this legitimate account, we go from nothing, including time, including space, including matter and energy and all the other things that make the universe. We go from that, we have darkness, we have light, and this is the first day. There are people who are better at arguing this next point than I, and I'll leave it to them. Suffice it to say, the literal interpretation of day one is proper. That is what the Hebrews understood. Any contest otherwise is largely trying to accommodate a more secular position of life. I'm going to leave that to the Apologetics Press guys to better argue it than myself, because that's not what we're here tonight to do. From there is a separation of waters. Now, we could go into a great big discussion about this particular point that we just simply don't have the time for, and frankly, it can get kind of speculative. The prevailing understanding of this is essentially what you see there, and bear in mind, we would have had light at this point, so perhaps this is kind of what the earth looked like on day 2, where we have the heavens and the different waters. We have water as we understand it, but also in the sky, you see those beautiful puffy clouds. Perhaps you know this from science class, or have just otherwise learned it throughout the years. Clouds are water. There is water in the heavens above us, and they weigh a lot. There is a lot of water. You could drown in a cloud if it weren't for the makeup of the cloud. And this is our second day. And you see how God is building upon what didn't exist before. So now we have a place to put stuff. And sure enough, on the next day, after the earth has been separated from the waters, on day 3, right, verse 9 says, "And let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, let the dry land appear, and it was so. God called the dry land earth," and so forth. And this is where plant life begins. As a quick aside, when you get into Genesis chapter 2, you'll notice that Adam is created, and then there is the Garden of Eden, where trees and all sorts of stuff come forth. It's like, well, I thought the trees all came before that. The garden was built for man. The earth was built prior to man, and that includes all the plant life. God can continue to create other things as things go on. It's not a contradictory account. Before we run out of time, let me zip through it's hard to ignore any of these points. But I can't get out of here without talking a little bit about animals. And I want you to understand that just about everything you see depicted up there is an animal. It looks like there are 2 exceptions to that. This is just a quick one that I could find online. It's pretty good representative. Everything up there is an animal that has this, what's called the breath of life, the nephesh. That becomes very important when you get into Genesis chapter 6, what takes place then, or at least what's beginning to be threatened then. The flood. So the breath of life is what this is, a very important concept, particularly when the flood shows up. We have birds. We have beasts that walk on the earth, things like wolves or bison or bears. I think even otters and beavers qualify for this. But we have the birds of the air. You see the owl and the eagle up there, the great sea beasts, of which the humpback whale is certainly one of them. Things that creep along the ground, that's kind of a catch-all term for what you might call a bug or a reptile or anything else like that. Sorry, bug haters and snake haters, God created those too. But that actually brings me to the point that I really want to get to. Did you notice that anytime he talked about plant life or animal life, there was this thing after its kind, and that thing after its kind? Kind. Did you catch all that? That word in the Hebrew is min. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that remotely properly. The term created kind is bara min. And what existed prior to the flood, probably prior to most written history, probably wasn't what you see up there. What we have today probably resembles, but does not quite look like what originally was created. Now you might say, now hold on a minute, Trevor, I thought you just said a few minutes ago to disregard evolution. Okay. There's a really cool group, we'll call it a field, that is being developed that has the proper worldview in mind. It's called creation science. It is simply science, which is nothing more than an observational tool that helps us to look at the world around us, quantify it, put it into categories, and then make some guesses about how it works. Creation science begins with the assumption that God created everything, and it also tends to occupy what's called the young earth creationist worldview. The one I occupy, I imagine most in here occupy. That's not a conversation we're going to bother with tonight. I promise I'm going somewhere with this. These created kinds, the ones that God created that eventually found themselves on the ark, right? Because everything that had the breath of life on it, remember our term nephesh a minute ago, that walked upon the earth, all of that was snuffed out in the Great Flood. That would have included the vast majority of these guys' ancestors. But something had to go on the ark. But it probably wasn't a wolf, a pair of wolves, and a pair of coyotes, and a pair of jackals, and a pair of aardwolves, and a pair, well, that's not actually a wolf, even though it's got wolf in the name. Maned wolves, red wolves, blah, blah, blah. You didn't know there were so many different kinds of dogs out there, did you? It was probably one thing that eventually, as it separated, was fruitful and multiplied and took over the earth, dominated the earth, filled the earth. Took a lot of different forms. It's that early dog, whatever it looked like, became what we have today, like my buddy Brutus, who is my sister's dog, who lives with me. She's like, this is my dog, don't you? It's where we get those beautiful timber wolves that live far north of even where I'm originally from. It's where we get those coyotes that drive you bonkers from time to time, those cute little red foxes, or maybe those annoying red foxes, depending on how many of you have had to deal with chickens and so forth. The reason I bring this up, and the reason I'm spending so much time with this, and I'm sure it's perhaps boring some of you to tears, let me bring this back to God. Where the secular worldview suggests that genetic mutation and random chance is something that can bring forth all of this biodiversity, a careful look at all of the things that must be true for that to be the case, it immediately breaks down. Because you need to have information in order for a mutation to do something. Mutation doesn't add information to the animal to make it something new. It shuts something off. It is less than what it used to be, which, by the way, all of this stuff that you see there, the bald eagle is inferior to something that was eagle kind before. Oh, man, I would have loved to have seen that bird. Some people are like, of course he said bird. Only God can create these things with a kind of diversity, with a kind of genetic material that it could go forth and satisfactorily fill the earth. And as Psalm 19 puts it, the heavens declare the glory of God. Y'all, it was a hopeless endeavor to try to get through Genesis chapters 1 through 3 in 45 minutes. It just wasn't going to happen. I literally intended on not getting through all of it because there was no hope. But you know where there is hope. What happened at the end of the sixth day? You see a clothed pair of people there and a baby. Clothes probably didn't happen on the 6th day. And a baby almost certainly didn't happen. But we know Adam and Eve. And we know they had Cain and Abel and Seth. And we know they had children. We know they had children. We know they had children, all the way up to what these wonderful actors and actress, I guess I'm not sure if it's 2 actresses or 2 actors, I imagine that's probably a little boy, are trying to replicate. Because that great God, who didn't need anything to create everything, so loved the world that he came to earth for you and me. That God who spoke, and it was. That God who was in the beginning and had his Spirit on the face of the waters. Do you know what John 1:1 says? In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And all the way down in verse 14, and the Word became flesh. That little actor, perhaps actress, is portraying the face of God as he came to this earth to die for you and me. There are a number of people in here I don't recognize, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm sorry you had to deal with my face. I'm sorry you had to deal with a little bit of a sciencey lecture at times tonight. But that means I don't know spiritually where you're at. I imagine there's a handful of people in this congregation, maybe perhaps more than a handful, who don't really know. And I'm here to tell you that if you have not taken on Christ, if you have not died to sin and been raised up in the waters of baptism, which simulates his death, which joins us together with him in death, Romans 6, chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, that, my friends, is something you need to get behind, because that great God who did what we just discussed tonight in a hopelessly brief sort of way, he loves you that much. I don't know what your needs are, but the Lord does. Please let them be known as together